Afternoon, Chuck Morse here at the Morse Force. I'm getting a little echo in my headphones. And the program is live Monday through Friday, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome, of course, to call us live at area code 617-396-4830. We'll take your phone calls, 617-396-4830. And my guest is Rick Winston. He is the author of Red Scare in the Green Mountains, Vermont in the McCarthy Era, 1946-1960. Rick, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Oh, great to be here, Chuck.
Rick, your book has a lot of very interesting, colorful characters in it from Vermont, people who were accused of communism in the 1950s primarily. Talk a little bit about the kind of the post-war atmosphere of Vermont. Apparently there were some pretty strong anti-communist figures in the state in those years. What was it like in those years to be a progressive in Vermont?
Yes, well, you may have noticed the subtitle on my book is Vermont in the McCarthy Era, 1946 to 1960. And part of the reason I used those dates was that I think using the term Red Scare in general takes the focus off Senator McCarthy himself. You go back in history and you see that McCarthy's reign on the national stage was relatively short. It was only 1950 to 1954. So we're really talking about that post-war period, 1946, when the wartime alliance between the U.S. and the USSR collapsed,
right.
Leading to a lot of suspicion and fear of communist domination and aggression without, and fear of infiltration and subversion within.
Right.
So being a progressive in those days was not an easy thing, as the people, one of my early chapters deals with the people who started to, the Vermonters for Henry Wallace campaign. Now, Wallace was running on a third party, actually a fourth party, if you will.
That's right.
Strom Thurmond had his Dixiecrats. And Wallace was criticizing Truman from the left, criticizing Truman's foreign policy, which was much more aggressive towards the Soviet Union than Roosevelt's had been. And the Vermonters who agreed with Wallace's point of view on that were kind of mercilessly red-baited by two of the major newspapers in the Burlington area, the Burlington Free Press, which is still going, much diminished, but still going,
yep.
And the Burlington Daily News, which was at that time the flagship paper of William Loeb.
Oh, yes, the legendary Manchester Union leader in New Hampshire.
It was a surprise to me to find out that Loeb actually put his flag down in Vermont before moving to Manchester, New Hampshire in the early 50s to take over the Union leader.
Right.
So, but Loeb had two papers in northwestern Vermont, and they succeeded, the Burlington Daily News, in keeping up a drumbeat against this one professor who gave a speech in Burlington saying that basically that the U.S. was not on the side of people who were wanting democracy, that they were the Truman administration was supporting colonialist efforts in Indonesia and Indochina, etc.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The Burlington Daily News went after this guy, saying he was not fit to be in the classroom with impressionable young minds, And this fellow named Luther McNair quit after a week. He resigned, and so once the election was held, Wallace had maybe 0.5% of the Vermont vote.
Sure.
But it was the people who were attracted to him were the core of Vermont progressives in that era.
What, obviously after World War II, I think there was certainly an overreaction nationally, and I'm sure Vermont is a microcosm of that, toward communism in this country. We felt that, and a lot of people who leaned left got caught up in it and got accused. I don't think there's any question about that. But nevertheless, there really was an issue with a communist entity in this country, and it did have somewhat dispassionate research of it shows that they did have fellow traveling groups, that they were allied with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was allied with the Nazis in the first 2 years of World War II, and that there was a lot of stuff going on there with the American Communist Party and its apparatus helping Hitler in those years by keeping the United States out of the war and by sabotaging Franklin Roosevelt's attempts to prepare for war. There were politically oriented strikes, and there was all the rest, the so-called Peace Party. They wanted peace because they were supporting Stalin and Hitler. And then, of course, when Hitler double-crossed Stalin in June of 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, they took a 180-degree turn, and all of a sudden they became super warlike and super patriotic. We got to go to war, we got to fight. And then after the war, in March of 1945, the Duclos letter, they took another 148-degree turn. And they once again took the position that the United States had to be out, totally neutral, and kind of a slightly anti-American position and a pro-Soviet position. So,
yeah, I wound up feeling a bit sorry for some of the rank and file Communist Party members, like my parents or like many of my parents' friends, saying, "Holy crap, what are we supposed to, what's the party line these days?"
Right.
One of the books I read in doing my research, a wonderful article, a wonderful book by a historian of this era and of the left, Morris Isserman.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote a book called "Which Side Are You On?"
Yes, so it's quite well known.
Yeah, and it kind of detailed the zigzags and the U-turns, and that Earl Browder was saying this, and all of a sudden there were people who were maneuvering to get Earl Browder out of. I've come to think of it as there was definitely a kind of a two-tier structure in the U.S. Communist Party. I'm not an expert on all these ins and outs, but I feel that there was the party hierarchy who were affected by such things as the Duclos letter and the decisions that were coming down on high, and the people who might have been working to aid the Soviet Union. And then there were the people who were just on the progressive left, and I find it's helpful to kind of get back into the mindset of young people on the left coming of age in the 30s during the Depression. They want to get involved in social justice movements. They want to get involved in racial equality movements. The Communist Party was kind of, one of your big options of where do you go to organize if you're really into starting a union in your particular factory.
Communists were very good organizers. No, that's one thing you have to give credit where credit's due. But there's one thing you could say about the international communist movement is that it did raise the prestige and the morale of labor. Not so much in this country. I'd say more in Latin America.
America, France, and Italy, for sure.
Oh yeah, but the thing is that you're quite right to point out that the American left-leaning liberal post-war period, these people were very anti-communist. I mean, in fact, it was Senator Hubert H. Humphrey in 1950 who put a bill before Congress to literally outlaw the Communist Party. It would make it a crime. And Senator McCarthy opposed it because he said that goes too far. So you had like Senator John F. Kennedy, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, Senator, the Fulbright. I mean, these people were very staunchly anti-communist, and in a way, almost more so than conservatives because it was an intra-left struggle.
Yeah, and you read about things such as the organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union doing their own purge.
Right.
And
that was in the 1930s when they got rid of Helen Gurley Flynn.
Yeah.
So, you have this left struggle going on. But nevertheless, I think that one of the Achilles heel of the American liberal movement is that they've never really been able to completely disavow the communist movement and its influence in the inner workings. I mean, and I think that history has shown that they really did have inroads into the U.S. government, starting pretty much accelerating with the election of FDR in 1933. One of the sources on that is the release of the decrypted Venona papers,
right?
Which shows that it shows a lot of people and their code names and how the Soviets, and also the work of Whittaker Chambers, of course, the great trial of the century, the Hiss Chambers case. He exposed a certain, and it wasn't just Alger Hiss. I mean, there was a long list of people who were very high level in the FDR administration who were supporting both Hitler and Stalin in the first 2 years of World War II.
Yeah, to get back to Vermont and the subject, yes. Some of those people who I think you were alluding to had summer homes in Vermont, and that is the subject of one of the chapters that it was actually the first. Chronologically, it was the first chapter that I wrote because it was such a fascinating story, and hardly anybody has written about it. It's in these two small towns, adjoining small towns right south of Montpelier. There were people who were in Alger Hiss's circle. Lee Pressman.
Oh yeah.
Nathan Witt, who is I think the counsel for the CIO, John Apt, who is the lawyer for the American Communist Party,
right, and the National Lawyers Guild,
yes.
One of the founders, yeah.
But in the next town over from them, there was not communists, but a summer resident was the East Asia scholar Owen Lattimore.
Oh, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
When Lattimore accused McCarthy of, when Lattimore was accused by McCarthy of being the top spy in the State Department, as a charge that had no basis in fact at all.
Right.
Lattimore had to sell his property for his legal fees. Turns out his lawyer at the time was Abe Fortas.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Later
Supreme Court, then he had to leave the Supreme Court because of corruption. Yeah. But and the Lattimore case is very interesting in that I don't think this has ever been definitively proven that he was a high-level member of the CPUSA. But I've done some research on him. He's written books. He was very prolific. If you look at his books and his writing and his philosophy, which is fairly easy to discern, it has that classic cagey totalitarian type language. It's all this, you hear this from certain people, very indirect, filled with sophistries and innuendos. It has some of at least the footprints of someone who was at least friendly with communism, and he did have some rather troubling policies with regard to helping Mao Zedong. I think
Well,
that's
yeah,
out of the public record.
he had been Roosevelt's personal emissary to Chiang Kai-shek.
There you go.
Had a very firsthand look at what he came to consider the corruption of the Kuomintang, and was with a number of people in the State Department who said, as a matter of pragmatism, that we can talk to these communist insurgents. They are the future. Chiang Kai-shek is not the future. Let's find out what they want. Let's talk to them. Those people were all purged from the State Department.
Well, yeah, that's the IPR scandal, which happened before Roosevelt died. And I forget the name of their scholarly publication. Was it Pacifica or something like that? It's on John Stewart Service, Carl Jaffe. These people, they did have, and this is the Venona Intercept, in a sense, confirms it, that they did have communist connections and that they were trying to undermine our ally Chiang Kai-shek, as imperfect as he was, and they were trying to support Mao Zedong. So, look, we can debate this back and forth. I would suggest that there was a group of people, whether they were legal, technically communists and members of the party or not, they were operating in the interests of the international communist movement. Yeah. In their, Harry Dexter White is another example, and I've actually looked at some of his papers at the National Archives. He was cutting gold supplies that had been promised to Chiang Kai-shek, which massively inflated Chiang's currency, and Chiang took on a lot of the costs of fighting World War II against the Japanese. He recruited people from Hollywood and what many conservatives like to call useful idiots to try to attack Chiang Kai-shek and to help Mao and to glamorize his movement. So, this is a big subject. There's a lot of history there. It was none other than a young congressman in 1950 who got up on the floor of the House and said that the United States had sold out our ally, Chiang Kai-shek, and had frittered away our victory in World War II. And that young congressman was John F. Kennedy. So, there are people on a lot of sides on that one.
But let me bring it back to Lattimore, because that's the subject. The subject of my the chapter is not Lattimore's past and his connection, but what happened to him and what happened to this little town as a result of McCarthy's charges. Right. Lattimore's friend, who kind of brought him to Vermont in the first place, volunteered to handle the land sale for Lattimore, because Lattimore was so wrapped up in his legal case, and put this property on sale. And the one and only person who was interested in buying it was a young couple who were moving from Alabama to. It turns out they were Communist Party organizers. Mm-hmm. So they bought the land, and this longtime resident of the next town over, Randolph Center, her name was Lucille Miller. She had been trying to alert people at the Boston Evening Record about Pressman and Witt and all this what she considered a communist cell right here in Randolph Center, and so the details of this land sale caused McCarthy to charge that this land sale was done for the of giving money to the Communist Party, caused a great local controversy. And the bulk of my chapter is about how that controversy was handled right in Bethel, with a local newspaper editor who kind of defused the whole situation within 2 weeks with the help of other Vermont newspaper editors and an investigative reporter that they paid to come up from New York City. And there was an incredible 6 part series that ran every day on the pages of 2 Vermont newspapers saying, here are the facts of the case. Lattimore was basically an innocent bystander in this land sale.
Right.
And so that's just a really fascinating story. And I only gave you the...
No, that's amazing. I mean, so that's the main crux of your book. And was Lattimore aware of the fact that those who were buying the property were Communist Party members, or he just wanted to unload the property?
Not until after the fact. Yeah.
Okay, because if you look at Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, he talks about this as being a standard practice of the American Communist Party to help people. Like for example, they arranged for a sale of Alger Hiss's property so he could get out from under debt, with a communist operative buying it, and then a communist operative buying his car, and Chambers, acting as a communist agent himself at the time, facilitated, according to his testimony, a lot of these purchases. So, that's not implausible that this could have happened. I mean, it's maybe McCarthy might have overstepped himself by running with it. I mean, he was a classic politician anyways. He would do anything to get his name in the paper. That's true. But so he might have jumped the gun. But nevertheless, if you look at it impassionately, there very well could have been some plausibility to that.
Yes. Well, anyway, it's 1 or 2 chapters in the book that it's funny. Here's this teeny state with these teeny towns, and there is a direct connection to this earth-shaking revolution in China. The other one comes with William Hinton, who was the author of the classic eyewitness account of the Chinese Revolution in one small village, Fanshan. And so I have a chapter on the history of the Hinton family and the founding of the Putney School, one of the more well-known progressive private schools that William Hinton's mother founded in the 30s.
Now, was Hinton a Communist Party member, or was he just a good old-fashioned progressive?
He all evidence points to the fact that he was a Communist Party member.
Okay. So after the situation with Lattimore and the sale of the property, what happened in that village, and what happened to what happened with Pressman and Witt and some of these other Summer people?
It turned out that by the time the story broke, only Pressman still had property, and he sold it shortly thereafter. The whole controversy kind of fizzled out after a very short amount of time.
Now, your book brings the story of the McCarthy period, as you call it. And by the way, let me just mention again, the book is Red Scare in the Green Mountains, Vermont in the McCarthy Era, 1946, 1960. And this is, of course, available at Amazon, and it's available if you ask for it at bookstores. It's a history of the progressive movement in post-war period in Vermont, right up to the 1960s. What happened right up till the, you bring the date 1960 as the end date of your story, and where was, so-called progressivism at that point? Yeah,
I was originally going to end the book in 1958 because historians. I'm not. I'm an amateur historian. I'm not that's not my trained field.
Right.
But I think historians often wrestle with the problem of, okay, we called this an era. So when does it start?
At McCarthy's death, right, in 58.
Then clearly the Red Scare did not end with McCarthy's death, because there were other senators like Senator Eastland, Senator Jenner, Senator Welker, who were every bit as anti-communist as McCarthy and less of a loose cannon than he was.
Right, and Senator Kennedy, I might throw in.
Yeah, and when William Hinton was called before the Senate Internal Security Committee, it was Eastland and Jenner and Welker who grilled him. But In 1958, a Democrat was elected to the U.S. Congress from Vermont for the first time in 104 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, not only was he elected, but he was elected on a platform which included nuclear disarmament and admission of Red China to the UN. And I thought to myself, if such a person can get elected from a rock-ribbed Republican state in 1958, well, that's a sign that things are changing. Well, I decided to end it in 1960 because he lost for re-election. And one of the reasons was that it was a presidential year and Vermont went overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
But, he was also attacked for being pro-communist, and he had a much stronger opponent in 1960 than he did in 1958. I think I didn't even mention his name, William Meyer.
Okay.
And there's a very interesting connection between then and now, because Meyer lost his 1960 re-election campaign. He ran again for, I think he ran again for Senate in 1962. He lost. He ran for Congress in 1966. He lost. He was diminishing returns.
Sure.
And at the same time, the Vietnam War was starting up, and he was getting progressively more disenchanted with the National Democratic Party. So in 1970, he decided to form a third party in Vermont, and he invited some of his younger friends, such as Bernie Sanders, recent rival at that point. So if you happen to get Bernie in a quiet moment and you say, who are your mentors and heroes, you would say Bill Meyer was definitely one of them. So what makes the topic of the book kind of so interesting is we go from a very solidly Republican state through the 40s, 50s into the 60s. And we're looking at it today from the point of view of, Bernie Sanders, Howard Dean, and how Vermont has changed in the last 50 years.
Interesting. And I think that, Bernie Sanders was the first openly socialist elected as first mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and then as U.S. Congress and then Senate, right?
Yeah.
What made? Did you know Bill Myers personally? I mean, did you meet him? What made him tick?
No, he actually. I moved to Vermont in 1970. I was vaguely aware of him, as somebody to vote for. I remember, the Liberty Union starting up. I remember I moved up in the fall of 1970, and Bernie was running he had his first run for governor on the Liberty Union ticket.
Okay.
That was my introduction to Bernie. But I didn't meet Bill. Bill died in the late 70s. But I did have long conversations with two of his three children to research this book.
And what was he? He wasn't pro-communist at all. Or was he?
No, he was what I would call it, a solid progressive. He was an internationalist. He was a peace activist. He believed he was an anti-militarist. He believed in cutting the military budget and working nations should work together on disarmament. Kind of,
understand, pacifist in a way.
Classic left pacifist, yes. And in fact, his son, one of his children, is named Carl Meyer, now about 80 years old, has become even more of a pacifist activist than his father was. And if you Google Karl Mayer, you'll see some of the anti-nuclear activities that he's done. And he has been a member of the Catholic Worker organization for many, many years.
Right. I certainly understand the anti-nuclear movement. My only criticism, and I think they reached a lot of their pinnacle in the 1980s, was they tended to be somewhat unilateral. They wanted the United States to disarm, but they would rarely mention the Soviet Union, which to me makes it sort of taints what you would think of as a moral standard. I mean, it's, why would they not be across the board? But I want to talk a little, what's happened with Vermont? Here you have Bernie Sanders, you have yourself, you have others who moved into the state. Bernie Sanders from New York. It seems to me that maybe what happened, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you had a large influx of very liberal people from New York, particularly in other areas, a lot of them nominally Jewish, like Bernie Sanders, move into Vermont and gradually become dominant in the political infrastructure. Is that true?
I wouldn't use the word dominant. I would say they took, in large numbers, they became activists within the Democratic Party and left of the Democratic Party, in the Liberty, in the Progressive Party. Our current lieutenant governor was running on a joint Progressive and Democratic ticket. But a friend of mine has written a book. Everywhere I go reading in my book, she's been there 2 weeks before, is going to be there 2 weeks after. She wrote a book about the big influx of young people in the 70s. The book is called Going Up the Country. Her name is Yvonne Daly. And her point is a lot of these people not only became active in politics, but also in various counterculture movements in arts and farming and forming co-ops and kind of changing the alternative culture of Vermont. So, I just, it's funny to look back and say, hey, gee, I was part of a historical movement. But, I was one of many people who moved to Vermont in the early 70s. It was a very tolerant atmosphere. And there was, and that tolerance also turns out to be one of the themes of my book, that I think anti-communism did not take quite the fanatical hold that it did in Vermont as it did, say, in New Hampshire, for very specific reasons having to do with personalities like William Loeb, but also a culture, a kind of a libertarian culture that goes way back. And the Vermont Republicanism is kind of the Republicanism of Abe Lincoln.
Right. For sure. The Republican Party was, very progressive in its founding in 1860 in Wisconsin. And I would argue it still is, but we could debate that.
Other time.
Is there like an old Vermont and a new Vermont kind of coexisting and next to each other? Because my brief experiences in Vermont, I've been to Brattleboro, Bennington, pretty much the southern part of the state, is that there is very much a very profoundly kind of counterculture, 60s-y influence on the place. You can see that in the way the place, the towns look. Same thing with Western Massachusetts. I'm here in Boston, so I go up this. But I guess my question is there, along with that, is there the old Vermont, the Vermont that was staunchly anti-communist in the 1940s and 50s? Are they still there, and do they coexist? Do they have any political say, or have they been put in their place?
Yeah, it's a complex issue because we saw a terrific cultural / political fight here in the early 2000s with these over the civil unions. Vermont was the first state to have civil unions.
Right.
And we saw a lot of kind of native conservatism come out, that perhaps the gay people, the out gay people, represented a threat to a Vermont that they grew up with, that they don't want to let go of. That has abated somewhat. But, that all generation is dying out. And for many of them, their children chose to leave the state. So there's been quite a population shift.
There's been an exodus of the old line, more patriotic, if you will, the conservative element. But I think it's interesting that you mention the long stream of libertarianism that makes up the Vermont character. It probably goes all the way back to the Green Mountain Boys of the Revolution with Ethan Allen.
You don't bother me. You won't bother me. I won't bother you.
That's right. I don't have to like you, but I'll respect your right to be who you are because I want you to respect me. And I think that part of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Vermont is the largest state in terms of per capita income ratio of gun owners. And that Bernie Sanders has been, for example, a supporter of the NRA and did so as a way, I don't know if he sincerely supports them, but he knew that that's part of getting elected because the average Vermonter is a gun owner. Is that true? And what is the attitude on that issue?
Again, this is one of the issues that makes Vermont such a fascinating state. Bernie was elected, I don't know, close to 70% of the vote. A very progressive congressman, Peter Welsh. But at the same time, we just returned a Republican governor for his second term.
Right.
A Republican governor who actually came out in favor of gun control legislation, which was a big deal, and he lost a lot of support. How many of those people, came back to him election day? But he won pretty convincingly. So there definitely is a strand in Vermont of, they're coming to get my guns. Gotta help.
That's right. And that includes liberals. I mean, that issue seems to me to be somewhat nonpartisan. It sort of is more of a libertarian versus, big government Eastern Seaboard type that wants to confiscate guns. And, and Massachusetts has a similar dynamic to Vermont in that we have a history of electing Republican governors, and yet our state legislature, our state house is very Democrat, very left.
I was just thinking about that this morning. There's Charlie Baker.
Yeah.
And there's
Romney. And then, it goes back. Bill Weld. I mean, these people were, very fiscally. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Massachusetts, even Vermont, there's like a kind of a harkening back to the Puritan times, the very tight with a buck, very fiscally conservative. That's why we didn't get swamped with the bank bailouts, because our banks are more conservative when they write loans. And so we like to have a conservative, or at least a fiscally conservative governor, to put a check on the state house, which is about as far left of Pyongyang. But the governor comes in and he has like a check to it, so it's a balanced government.
Well, there's one. I was talking about this libertarianism. One thing that I found to my pleasure when I moved up here was that I noted the tolerance, and I saw that the newcomers did not regard the old timers as hicks, and the old timers did not regard the newcomers as just hippies that they couldn't talk to. There was a lot of give and take. And one thing that comes clear in my friend Yvonne Daly's book is that a lot of the young people on the communes would not have survived their first few winters if it had not have been for the old farmers down the road who helped them out and passed on their knowledge to them. It's a wonderful dynamic up here, and I was very curious to see how that played out in a previous time.
Interesting, and also I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Vermont is if not the whitest state in the country, certainly one of them.
It's pretty close, and in fact, just yesterday there was a radio show about how do we get more diversity, especially in the colleges up here. Very, very interesting. It is changing that way. It is definitely changing.
Okay. Well, listen, Rick, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. You and I share a great interest in, the history of the communist influence, the progressive influence in the United States. I mean, we come at it from a different perspective, but we're both kind of armchair historians on the topic.
Well, it's been very stimulating conversation. So
thank you very much, and congratulations on the book. All right, Rick Winston is the author of the new book, Red Scare in the Green Mountains, Vermont in the McCarthy Era, 1946-1960, available at Amazon and bookstores. Rick, thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.